You know that moment at a family dinner when someone brings up money in front of the in-laws, and everyone suddenly develops an intense interest in the salad? That is roughly the energy in Washington right now, because a major American bank just did something banks almost never do to a former sitting president's business empire. And instead of a scandal, we got salad. So, let us talk about the salad. A bank, not a tabloid, not a rival campaign, an actual federally regulated bank, looked at the accounts belonging to the Trump Organization and decided the safest move was to shut the whole financial crimes review team down and close the relationship. And the reason given internally was the phrase every compliance officer dreads typing into a memo: money laundering risk. Now, before you assume this is one more partisan food fight, sit with the actual sequence of events for a second, because the sequence is the story. Reuters and NPR both reported the same basic shape of it. Capital One, after years of scrutiny, made a call that its own financial crimes team, a team stocked with people who had decades of law enforcement experience, the kind of resumes that read like a Netflix true crime miniseries, determined the Trump Organization's accounts carried enough red flags that the relationship needed to end. Not, we disagreed on fees, not, the paperwork was messy. Money laundering rule violations. That is the allegation on the table. And here is the part that should make you sit up slightly straighter in your chair. The Trump Organization did not quietly move its accounts somewhere else and hope nobody noticed, the way most businesses would when they get dumped by a bank for this reason. It sued. It is suing Capital One, arguing this was political discrimination connected to January 6th, which, I want to be fair here, is a legally available argument. Companies sue banks over account closures all the time. But notice what the lawsuit does not dispute. It does not dispute that the rule violations happened. Capital One, according to the reporting, has the receipts to back that part up. The fight is entirely about motive, not about whether the smoke was there. And when your legal strategy is yes, there was smoke, but you only notice the smoke because you don't like me, that is not exactly a defense that ages well. Now, of course, while all of this was unfolding in a courtroom, something much quieter was unfolding in Congress. And quiet is always where you should be looking. The Trump administration has been working to gut the Corporate Transparency Act. And I want you to appreciate the comedy of this particular detail, because Secretary of State Marco Rubio, back when he was a senator, was one of the sponsors of this exact law. And he called it, I am not making this up, my Corporate Transparency Act. He was proud of it. He put his name on it like a kid signing a school project. The entire point of the law was embarrassingly simple. If you open a shell company in the United States, you have to put a real human name on it. You cannot just be an anonymous folder full of legal paperwork moving money around. It was one of the very few genuinely bipartisan anti-corruption measures to pass in years. And now, the administration that inherited it is quietly dismantling the very transparency requirement one of its own top officials used to brag about authoring. If you are looking for a 3-word summary of modern Washington, my Corporate Transparency Act, being gutted by the same government Marco Rubio now serves in, might just be it. Here is why that matters more than it sounds like it should, because shell company paperwork is not exactly a phrase that gets your pulse racing. The United States for years now has been the single largest destination for money laundering on planet Earth. Not a rival to the top, the actual top. Ahead of the offshore islands you're picturing right now, ahead of the places with the flashy reputations. Shell companies with no named owner are the plumbing that makes that possible, and it is not just about hiding a rich person's yacht money. It is the same plumbing used for terrorism financing, arms trafficking, and drug trafficking, because dirty money from all of those activities eventually needs somewhere clean-looking to sit. So when a law built specifically to force a name onto that, plumbing gets quietly gutted at the exact moment the president's own company is being sued for allegedly using that plumbing, you are allowed to notice the timing. Nobody is asking you to assume a conspiracy. You are simply allowed to notice that the people writing the rules and the people whose accounts got flagged under the old rules are, in this particular instance, the same family. Spoke with is generous. I watched the interview like the rest of you. Russian-born novelist and longtime Trump and Putin critic Gary Steingart, who put it about as bluntly as a person can put it on television. He said you would not even see corruption this openly done in a country like Russia, calling it 17th century. the king is always right and takes whatever he wants level corruption, and then added, almost as an aside, that nobody commits crimes quite this openly. Nobody crimes like this in his words. And I want to sit with that phrase for a second, because it is doing more work than it sounds like. The scandal, in his framing, is not merely that alleged wrongdoing may have occurred. Every country on earth has produced corrupt officials. The scandal is the absence of any attempt to hide it. Historically, corruption wears a disguise. It shows up in a tuxedo, pretends to be a normal business transaction, hopes nobody looks too closely. What people like Steingart are describing here is corruption that has stopped bothering with the tuxedo entirely. Which brings us to NYU history professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who studies authoritarian leaders for a living. Mussolini to the present, quite literally, that's the title of her book. And her read on this was less scandal of the week and more recognize the pattern. Her argument roughly is that corruption sits at the actual center of how autocratic leadership functions, not at the edges of it, and that transparency is corruption's natural enemy, which is precisely why a transparency law gets targeted the moment it becomes inconvenient. Her point is not that any single official did one bad thing. Her point is that you can watch the machinery being built in real time, gut the disclosure law, so ownership stays hidden. Go after the press, so the story about the hidden ownership never gets told loudly enough to matter, and reshape the Justice Department and judiciary so that even if the story does get told, nobody official is required to act on it. 3 separate moves. 1 coherent outcome. She was careful, and I will be careful too, to say that no court has actually ruled on whether the underlying money laundering allegations are true. That process has not happened. But, and this is the uncomfortable part, you can lose an account and lose it for cause, well before any of that gets litigated. Banks are not courts. They are risk managers, and apparently in this instance, the risk got too loud to ignore quietly. And this is not, it turns out, an isolated incident sitting alone in the news cycle. Reporting has surfaced that roughly 300 accounts connected to associates and adjacent networks were closed over the same category of concern banks internally label AML, anti-money laundering issues. 300. Most ordinary operating businesses, the kind that sell insurance or run a chain of dry cleaners, never once in their corporate lifetime experienced this problem, because most ordinary businesses are not moving the kind of money through the kind of structures that triggers a compliance department's attention in the first place. So, when the family business at the center of the executive branch is simultaneously the subject of a lawsuit over exactly this issue, and also the direct beneficiary of the rollback of the exact law meant to prevent exactly this issue, you start to understand why people keep reaching for the word unprecedented, a word that gets used so often these days it has nearly lost its meaning, except in this specific case it appears to have been selected quite deliberately by historians whose entire career is comparing this era to the ones that came before it. And the scale involved is not small. Reporting has put a figure of roughly $2.2 billion on the president's personal earnings during this period, layered on top of family investments spreading into drones and cryptocurrency, ostipasi, crypto being, of course, delightfully, almost suspiciously, still largely unregulated, which is a coincidence I will simply leave sitting there in the middle of the room without comment. And the pattern is not contained to one family. It is extended outward to the family of Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick as well, which is exactly the shape Ben-Ghiat describes when she talks about mafia state dynamics. Not a metaphor she uses lightly, but a specific structural description of what happens when private financial interest and public office stop being separate categories, and instead become the same category wearing 2 different name tags. Now, every democracy on earth, and I do mean every single one, has individual corrupt officials somewhere in its ranks. That part is not unique, and it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise. What Ben-Ghiat is describing as genuinely different under autocratic drift is not the presence of individual corruption, but its systemization. The moment it stops being a scandal that gets punished and starts being a playbook that gets protected. You gut the transparency law. You go after the outlets that report on the gutting. You take the Justice Department out of the business of pursuing dereliction of duty by your own allies. And then, and this is the part with actual historical receipts attached to it, you start handing out pardons to people convicted of exactly the kind of financial crime you are otherwise supposedly opposed to, a move Ben-Ghiat points out with a certain grim familiarity, because Mussolini did it, and Pinochet did it, and now, in her assessment, so has this administration. So, what does any of this actually cost the United States, beyond the headline of the week? Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. The reason the American financial system has commanded global trust for the better part of a century is not because Americans are inherently more honest than anyone else. It is because the system had rules, and the rules were at least nominally enforced, regardless of who you were. The moment that stops being true, the moment foreign kleptocrats, and yes, we mean Russian ones, we mean Chinese ones, watching from very far away with very great interest, start to understand that the American financial system's biggest anti-corruption safeguard just got quietly switched off at the exact moment it might have applied to the people at the top. That trust does not evaporate instantly. It erodes, slowly, then all at once, the same way credibility usually does. Allies begin quietly diversifying where they park sensitive money and sensitive partnerships, the same way Canada quietly diversified its fighter jet contracts. And once that diversification habit starts, it rarely fully reverses, because institutions once burned tend to build in redundancy permanently rather than temporarily. So, the honest, unglamorous conclusion, as I sit here putting this together, is that we do not yet know how the lawsuit resolves, and we do not yet know whether the underlying allegations will ever formally be tested in a courtroom rather than a cable news panel. What we do know, because it is not a matter of opinion, is that the law built specifically to prevent this exact category of concealment is being dismantled in real time by people who once took public credit for building it, at the precise moment their own political family found themselves on the receiving end of an accusation it was designed to catch. You are, of course, welcome to call that a coincidence. I will simply note that a nation that spent decades lecturing the rest of the world about transparency now appears to be quietly grading its own homework, and grading it rather generously. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you think stories like this deserve more attention than a single news cycle gives them, stay a while, subscribe, and let's keep watching what everyone else stopped looking at.